physical abuse, divorce, addictions are all, in all of its various forms, are on the rise. Why? Because we have become idle and we do not like to wait too long. And so when we have nothing to do that keeps us from the old ways, we go back to doing things which are not productive or lead us down a path that will get us into trouble. But the old ways give us something to act upon, something to do, even if, as Peter said, I am going fishing. Even though it is an old habit, we find comfort in them, because when we are doing these old habits, we are no longer idle, we are no longer waiting. We have become distracted from what we are waiting on and from whom we are waiting for. So when God calls us out, He does not want us to look back and fall into the old ways in which He had just called us out from. God calls us out from the old ways. And He doesn't want us to go back. When you look at what happened after Exodus 32:1 and verses 2 through 4, we see that Aaron said to them, take off the gold earrings of your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the earrings and brought them to Aaron, and he took what they handed him, and he made them into an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. You see, the people have been waiting for too long for Moses. And in their idleness, they had sinned and fallen back to the old way of life, which was fashioning a god in the image of an Egyptian calf, which was a very common idol in Egypt. And they had just spent 400 years in slavery. They had fallen back to the things that they had become used to. In their time of waiting in idleness, they had fallen back to the old ways. And so they had Aaron fashion an idol for them in the image of an Egyptian god of a calf. You see, when we are waiting, we do not need to relapse. But when we are idle, the old ways call to us, and they slowly begin to gnaw at us and nip at our minds, saying, remember doing this and doing that. Come back while you are waiting, for we will have something for you to do. And eventually, despite all our waiting and patience and our strength of demeanor and self-discipline, we end up giving over to the old ways of life, just as Peter gave away to going back to being a fisherman just for one day. For we fall back to the pattern of this world, which leads us to doing things which are not what God wants us to do. In Ephesians 4:22, Paul says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. Or as Peter writes in 1 Peter 1:14, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. You see, we are called to not go back to the old ways in which God has called us out, because the old ways distract us from God. They keep us from doing His will. They keep us from waiting on Him to see His goodness and see how His hands move in our lives. For the old habits are hard to get rid of. It takes time to change, to unlearn, or even replace them with a new habit. It takes effort and focus to keep moving forward. And we all struggle during this time of waiting because we want to get out and do something. We have to do something, but during this time of waiting, it is leading us to head back to the old ways of life, to do the old things which we have not done in some time. And so we fall back into the old ways of doing. We conform to the patterns of this world. And so Peter, just like we are now, Peter sees the old way of life calling him back to board a boat, to cast his net into the water, and to become a fisherman once again. And so he can no longer ignore this call, and so he goes back to fishing, goes back to the way of life that he knows. We are very much like Peter, who when we are struck being idle and waiting, we return to being our old ways because we have become a people of action. We need something to do. When we cannot regularly do our normal habits, we tend to fall into the old ways of our life, our destructive habits. But when we wait is when we tend to get ourselves in trouble. We stop moving forward. And this is why we are looking at Peter during this time of the miraculous catch. You see, when God calls us out of something, He does not want us to go back to it. Rather, He wants us to move forward with Him in relationship with Him. Abraham was called out by God to leave his father and mother and the land he grew up in and head to a new land that God was going to show them. He was calling Abraham to move forward with Him in relationship. Not to mention that Abram and Sarah also had to wait a long period for a promised son until they were both old with age. You see, Peter, James, John, Andrew were called out to be fishers of men. And here we see 3 of these disciples were out fishing on the water when Christ appears on the shore. But yet they do not know Him. And He gives them instruction to throw their nets on the other side of the boat. And they begin to catch fish. And so when this happens, the disciple whom Jesus loved said, "It is the Lord." And the moment Peter hears these words, Peter does something very interesting. He puts on all his clothes, and then he jumps out of the boat with his clothes on and swims to where Jesus is on the shore. You see, Peter is no longer waiting for the catch of the fish to be brought into the boat, or for the boat to tow the catch back to shore so they could drag it up onto land. Rather, Peter is tired of waiting, so he jumps out of the boat and swims ashore. He is tired of waiting. He is moving towards his risen Lord. You see, when we are called by God, it is about moving forward towards Him in relationship with Him, to draw closer to Him, and to see His goodness and His plans for our lives. You see, we should not be returning to or falling back to the old ways of doing things, to our old life. Rather, He has called us into something new, called us to move forward to be a new creation, and not to grow tired or wearied as we wait. For we need to be striving to be closer to God during this time of waiting, rather than trying to fall back into the old ways of life. For Christ calls us into a new life, a new way of doing things. He calls us out of the old ways and not to return to them. We should be like Peter, who jumps out of the boat and swims towards God. As Isaiah 43:18 tells us and reminds us of how we need to not return to the old ways. We see in Isaiah 43:18, we are instructed to forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. That we are to forget the ways of the old life. Or in Ephesians 4:23 through 24, and that you, being renewed in the